What lessons can Israel and by extension NATO learn from Israel's post-October 7th conflict in Gaza and Lebanon? I interviewed 50 Israeli soldiers from across the spectrum of jobs, from infantrymen to truck maintainers. Everybody had something valid to say. This video is an AAR, or after action review. It's a structured debrief used by the military to analyze a mission or operation after it occurs. It covers what went right, what went wrong, and what you can do to improve. This video is about what went right. You can find the full video at ryanmcbeth.substack.com for paid members. It's only $5. I try to keep it cheap. There's also a slideshow available on Substack and my AAR white paper. If you want me to come to your unit and give this slideshow presentation, reach out to me through email. And if you want to support the channel, grab my Intel Life t-shirt from Bunker Branding. Some background. The Israeli Defense Forces was born in 1948 in a fight for survival. Their heritage still shapes how they fight today, for good and for bad. Unlike most Western armies, Israel doesn't have the luxury of oceans and allies on every border or years to spin up reserves. The entire country can fit inside the state of New Jersey. Their active duty army isn't very large, maybe around 170,000 personnel, although that can fluctuate based on conscription rates. Total reserve strength could theoretically reach 465,000 personnel. During the wars in Gaza and Lebanon, Israel activated roughly 300,000 reservists. The IDF's strength comes from its people, a highly educated, technically skilled population, but this is also its weakness. The system depends heavily on reservists. Every Israeli knows they can be called up within just a few hours' notice. The IDF prizes improvisation. There is this War of Independence mythology that a soldier can grab a rifle and figure it out and win through grit. That spirit helped them in 1948, 1956, 1967, and 1973. And that tension between flexibility and professionalism is something called Berchabi u Vakashti, meaning with my sword and bow. It literally defines everything that went right and wrong in Gaza, but we'll get to that later. Two more things to make the Israeli army unique. First off, they are an army of conscripts. Conscription is mandatory for citizens of Jewish and Druze descent. Both men and women serve, although men serve longer terms than women. Druze women, Muslims, and Christians are not conscripted, as well as ultra-Orthodox Jews. However, some Muslims, Christians, and ultra-Orthodox volunteer. It's not common, but it's not totally uncommon. Because of these draft exceptions, Israel really only has access to roughly 80% of its possible military-age fighting force. That being said, the military is woven into the fabric of daily life, and people are usually proud of their service. During the early parts of the conflict, the unit might show up at a kibbutz near where it's deploying. The kibbutz would feed them until a contracting officer could coordinate for a formal food contract. Imagine an American National Guard unit deploying to a disaster area and just kind of hoping the locals would feed them until the logistics contract could be signed. That would never happen. But in Israel, due to the unique nature of their people's army, it worked. So while watching this video, understand that you are dealing with an army that has a unique set of security challenges that are not faced by NATO. So how Israel fights isn't necessarily worse than NATO, it's just different and tailored to their unique security challenges. Second, the IDF doesn't have a professional NCO, or non-commissioned officer corps, the way most NATO armies do. That is, professional sergeants. There's a reason for this. It's the reason Israel does everything the way it does, because it's cheaper that way. If you use per capita gross domestic product, Israel's economy is roughly the same size as Wisconsin, and they need to maintain an army and air force, and to a lesser extent a navy, in a very dangerous part of the world. So while you watch this video, when something seems a little strange, especially if you're familiar with NATO militaries, remember, Israel is just looking for the most cost-effective solution to a problem. And if you're looking to dig deeper into the IDF, you need to use ground news. I have been living in a hotel the past few days because my house flooded, and that has really sucked, but there's been one consistency, and that's ground news. I read ground news every day. I actually pay for it. They don't give it to me for free. I was actually reading this article. Japanese Prime Minister put a Ford F-150 truck outside of a palace in Tokyo. What's interesting is I read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times every day. They didn't cover this. But not only does ground news cover these interesting little stories, they show you who covered them, whether they sit on the left, the center, or the right. And then for each publication, they show you who owns the publication, the factuality rating, and whether they lean left or right. So you know who's telling you what to think. I think I'm pretty well informed because I read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, but you might miss stuff, and that's where the blind spot report comes in. All right, so you click the blind spot report right here, and this is going to show you news stories that you may have missed because of your own political bias. For example, Congress under the gun as military pay dries up. Nobody on the left covered this story. Or here, Britain announced new wind farm. If you're on the right, nobody covered that story. So click the link in the description below, hit the QR code somewhere over there, go to ground.news/Ryan to get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is what I use every single day to stay informed. Let's start with what went right. And we have to start at the macro level with standing advantages. The first item up is Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. He could speak and read Hebrew to the point where he even translated books from Hebrew into Arabic, including biographies of Israeli leaders and manuals. It is likely that he believed that after Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, which is what we in the West call October 7th, 2023, he expected Israel to launch short, limited raids focused on rescuing hostages or fighting similarly to Israel's previous methods during limited conflicts in 2006 and 2014. He was also an avid consumer of Israeli media. Now, I read Haaretz every day. If there's one thing the Israeli media is good at, it's criticizing itself. In the months leading up to the attacks, Israel was deeply divided over proposed reforms to limit the power of its Supreme Court. Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar may have interpreted that as internal discord, as a sign that Israel was too divided to mount a coherent response. He was wrong. A second item that went right, at least in Israel's case, was President Trump's election. Now, whether you're a supporter of President Trump or not, his election did give Israel more freedom to operate than it had under President Biden. When President Trump ordered Iranian nuclear sites to be struck by B-2 bombers, that was a major signal to the Arab world that Israel was not going to be restrained by U.S. foreign policy. A third item is Israel's focus on Hezbollah and Iran in the north. The 2023 Gaza conflict wasn't just one war, it was really 8. The war against Hamas, the war against Hezbollah, the war against Iran, the war against Syria, the war against the Houthis, the war against pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, stabilization operations in the West Bank, and finally the information war, which Israelis call the Eighth Front. One reason that Israel may have missed signs of a Hamas attack was that most of their intelligence was focused on Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iran. There were only a limited number of intelligence officers to go around. Hezbollah was the varsity team. They had advanced weapons and drones smuggled from Iran through Iraq and Syria. Hezbollah had somewhat of a professional military force that was essentially a shadow army of Lebanon. Whereas Hamas wasn't even considered the junior varsity team. They were more like the intramural squad, and they could be managed. Hamas's weapons were limited to what they could manufacture or what could be smuggled in through tunnels in Egypt. And the Iron Dome system, as successful as it was, managed the threat of shooing rockets away the way someone might shoo away a fly during a picnic. When Israel decided to attack southern Lebanon in September of 2024 and perform airstrikes on Iran in June of 2025, all of that intelligence that was collected on Iran and Hezbollah proved very useful. Ultimately, this led to the systematic targeting of leadership actors in Lebanon, Iran, and Qatar. The fourth standing advantage is geography. Israel has very short supply lines. Gaza is about 8 miles or so at its widest point. This made it a lot easier for Israel to push supplies into Gaza and get casualties out. Typically, logistics for the attacking force are much more complex than they are for the defending force because everything has to be brought with you. In this case, the size of the battle space worked to Israel's strategic and operational advantage. Let's talk strategy. This starts with combined arms. Combined arms, or what Israel calls battle teams, was extremely successful. Combined arms is a doctrinal term describing the synchronized employment of different types of military forces and capabilities, such as infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, aviation, and electronic warfare, so that each complements and reinforces the other. Tanks are tough, and they provide great firepower, but they're very vulnerable to short-range rocket attacks, so you screen the tanks with infantry. Each supports each other, combined arms or battle teams. This is practiced by many modern armies, but one crucial element to success is that Israeli leaders are fluent with the capabilities of units and equipment down to the platoon level. So if an IDF infantry lieutenant had a tank attached to his platoon, he knew how to properly employ that tank. That really isn't something the U.S. Army teaches until an officer gets to the company level. This came up constantly, with at least 6 of those surveyed praising Israel's combined arms strategies directly. Next is fire coordination. Air cover, and to a lesser extent MALE or medium altitude long endurance UAVs, were constantly overhead in Gaza monitoring the battle space. Fire coordination officers at the time were able to call anything from mortars to UAVs to naval gunnery to airstrikes very, very quickly. Close air support was also omnipresent. That was almost always an aircraft circling overhead to provide support to any unit that got in trouble. They also coordinated asynchronous fire missions where they might fire a few mortar rounds in one area to throw off pattern recognition and then attack somewhere else. And again, that's something you might only be able to do when your logistical tail is relatively small. It's hard to imagine Ukraine or even Russia at this point firing a bunch of artillery shells as a diversion, then attacking in a different place. But in Israel's case, the vast majority of artillery never had to enter Gaza. Let's talk engineering. It worked out well, with Israel using assets such as armored Caterpillar D9 bulldozers to demolish houses where IEDs or improvised explosive devices might lie. There was heavy emphasis on destroying suspected sniper and IED emplacements with bomb units or D9 bulldozers once that building was identified. There are people who like to post images of the destruction in Gaza and insinuate that it wasn't possible for a militant or a bomb to be in every single one of those buildings. And the truth is that yes, not only was it possible, it was actually happening. Those D9 bulldozers in high-risk areas saved a lot of lives. Next is the humanitarian line of effort. Generally, the IDF did a good job at minimizing civilian casualties. Soldiers, with some exceptions, understood the rules of engagement and their obligations under the IDF Code of Ethics. While there were many problems with the delivery of humanitarian aid, ultimately, the work of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation created a stable and secure area where aid could be delivered, although this did not occur until May of 2025. Generally, the practice of making civilians move from the north to the south and back again reduced casualties. The operation to evacuate the city of Rafah before entering also worked, but there were a number of missed opportunities. We'll cover that and what went wrong. The next section is intelligence. On October 7th, 2023, Israel was fixated on Hezbollah and Iran, but they were quickly able to pivot to Hamas. Daily intelligence briefings established after the first few weeks provided timely and actionable information to deployed units. Prior to entering Gaza, personnel with prior experience in Lebanon received focus orientation sessions to ensure they understood the distinct operational environment, enemy composition, tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, unique to Gaza. This improved situational awareness and reduced learning curve helped units transition between theaters. Now let's talk drones. Despite a year of combat in Ukraine that clearly demonstrated the utility of organic small arms UAS drones, the IDF did not systematically field platoon or company level drones. Personnel improvised. Soldiers began buying commercial off-the-shelf or COTS, quadricopters, and integrated them into unit ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, loitering assets, effectively creating an ad hoc drone capability at the tactical edge. In fact, the drone that was used to kill Yahya Sinwar was donated by the Orthodox Jewish Chamber of Commerce, a Teaneck, New Jersey fundraising group. In some cases, Israeli soldiers who were serving in Ukraine returned home to pioneer the Israeli drone effort at the tactical edge. These drones were used to clear tunnels with mixed success. I'll explore that in the what went wrong section, but they were very successful at scouting out the areas around tunnels and the insides of houses before going in by force. Now let's talk information war. Israel effectively managed the internal and, to a lesser extent, external information environment throughout the conflict. Messaging across television, print, and interviews was coordinated and generally reinforced national objectives. Communicating the operational needs to the home front was timely, it was coherent, it was credible. This effectiveness can be partially attributed to Israel's conscription-based society. A significant portion of the population possesses firsthand military experience, which reduces the cognitive gap between the armed forces and the civilian audience. As a result, public affairs and information operations personnel faced fewer barriers when communicating military actions, terminology, and requirements. Unlike volunteer force nations, Israeli communicators did not need to simplify technical language or explain fundamentally different military concepts to gain public understanding or support. Next, let's talk about communications. Communications between units were generally effective and reliable throughout operations. This success can be attributed in part to the adversary's limited electronic warfare capability, or EW. This allowed the IDF to operate with near total dominance of the electromagnetic spectrum. With little enemy interference, Israel effectively owned the spectrum, enabling uninterrupted voice and data communications across echelons. Units also demonstrated adaptability and initiative by employing commercial applications such as WhatsApp and Telegram to supplement standard communications. These platforms allowed rapid coordination and imagery sharing at the tactical level, although they did present security risks. One reservist described the ad hoc process as follows. I see a baddie in the window. I send the tank commander for a picture and a GPS coordinate or an agreed upon name for the baddie position, and we close the loop. That way, instead of hogging comms, which could be used for evac and quick mission sit reps. Now, if you are a member of the NATO military, you probably just had a heart attack. The idea is soldiers using cell phones to coordinate a fire mission, but soldiers will improvise solutions to battlefield problems. This reflects a bottom-up innovation in digital targeting and battle tracking under permissive electronic warfare conditions. So let's talk training. Unlike many NATO reserve forces that train on fixed recurring drill schedules like monthly drills plus an annual 2-week training, the IDF reserve system is call-up driven and measured in service days per year, with frequency and duration adjusted to operational need. The initial large-scale mobilization of reservists placed significant strain on Israel's training infrastructure. Active and reserve formations competed for access to limited ranges and facilities, creating scheduling conflicts and uneven training opportunities during the first few weeks of the war. As the campaign matured, the IDF adapted rapidly. They updated doctrine, lessons learned, enemy tactics, techniques, and procedures were disseminated across units at an accelerated pace. This continuous feedback loop allowed battalion commanders to integrate the latest intelligence and tactical lessons into ongoing operations. Logistics performance was a notable success. Operational logistics plans existed for a wide range of contingencies, and personnel at all echelons demonstrated familiarity with procedures and a clear understanding of their roles without significant retraining. The result was a responsive sustainment environment which supported both maneuver and prolonged operations. So now let's talk equipment and logistics. Many reservist logisticians were also mechanics and truck drivers in their civilian jobs, and they had high standards for performing their duties. Despite strong procedural logistical readiness, initial execution encountered friction. Early logistical shortfalls stemmed primarily from pre-war planning assumptions focused on a northern contingency operation against Hezbollah in Lebanon. As a result, key stocks of equipment, fuel, supplies, they were positioned in locations unsuitable for the southern theater in Gaza. The redistribution of material and reconfiguration of supply routes created temporary delays in sustainment during the opening phase of operations. These challenges were rapidly addressed during the first few weeks through adaptive planning and decentralized problem solving. By June 2024, logistics operations had stabilized and they were functioning efficiently, characterized by timely resupply, responsive maintenance support, and effective coordination between combat and sustainment elements. A distinctive feature of the Israeli Defense Force is the enduring cultural influence of the 1948 War of Independence. The soldiers in that conflict, often fighting with little more than rifles and a handful of magazines, remain deeply idolized within Israeli military tradition. That legacy fostered the Baharbi Uvakashti mindset across the force. The early fighters had no mortars, no machine guns, no radios, just the will to win and the ingenuity to make it work. That example shapes today's IDF ethos. Even when modern units face equipment shortages or thin logistical support, the institutional reflex is Baharbi Uvakashti. Improvise, adapt, execute the mission rather than wait for ideal conditions. Now I want to touch on food. The IDF is not an expeditionary army. It should not be compared to NATO forces that routinely deploy overseas. NATO units train to move and sustain themselves halfway around the world, so they develop lightweight, shelf-stable rations like modern MREs or meals ready to eat. Israel doesn't really have that. The IDF fights close to home, within driving distance of their own logistical hubs. So instead of high-tech field rations, they still rely on canned meals. And even those are only issued when a unit expects to operate away from their base or assembly area for an extended period. Soldiers compensated for this by bringing their own food for patrols, primarily protein bars and tortillas. That being said, the Israeli army often contracts with local food vendors to prepare and deliver meals for their soldiers. Oftentimes this is done at battalion or even company level. The donations of food by civilians went against standard army practices, but it was ignored due to the exceptional circumstances in that situation. I had one soldier even tell me that he gained weight from all the donated food whenever he went to Lebanon. I will have more feedback on how Israel fed its army in the What Went Wrong section. Now let's talk about professionalism. The Israeli Defense Forces maintain a professional force, but their concept of professionalism differs from that of most Western militaries. The IDF operates as a people's army, reflecting its deep integration into Israeli society rather than a distinct warrior class. Unlike NATO militaries, where service is often confined to a professional volunteer cadre, the Israeli model touches nearly every household. Conscription means that nearly every family member has someone serving or knows someone who's served, and that changes the relationship between the military and the public. The result is a force that feels less like an institution apart and more like an extension of society itself. That familiarity produces a different kind of professionalism. You'll see soldiers carrying rifles on buses and shopping malls, even stopping for coffee on the way to base. Rank is respected, but interpersonal communication tends to be informal and pragmatic. In many cases, position, meaning what you actually do, matters more than the insignia on your sleeve. It's less, yes sir, roger sir, or more, yalla, what's the plan? This isn't the polished professionalism that you see at Fort Bragg, but functional professionalism. It works because the entire country understands the mission, the stakes, and the culture behind it. Now, generally, professionalism differed among active duty and reservists. Reservists tended to be less disciplined and professional than their active duty counterparts. But every reserve army is like this. The IDF is just no different. Israel's military recruits tend to come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. Because of that, they often bring better education, stronger problem-solving skills, and higher cognitive aptitude into the force. Unlike conscription systems in places like Russia, where the draft disproportionately pulls from poorer or less educated populations, Israel's mandatory service pulls from across society, including the middle and upper classes. The result is a military that fields soldiers who are, on average, more educated, more adaptable, and more capable of independent action and decision-making on the battlefield. Another thing to note here is that, at least at first, everyone had a willingness to fight. This came up at least 8 times in my surveys, although among reservists that willingness started to fade as they were called up for multiple deployments. I'll also say that on October 10th, 2023, just 3 days after the attacks, when you logged into Google and you typed in the word flights 2, the very first term for autocomplete was the word Israel. That's how many Israelis were trying to get home, either to see their families or to return to Israel to join their old reserve units. This includes people who had been out of the reserves, people my age, in their 50s, who weren't even in the reserves anymore, were trying to go back to Israel and fight. I know this because they contacted me when they wanted advice on equipment they intended to purchase. Families prepared food packages for refugees and soldiers. People showed up at hospitals to donate blood or help the families of the wounded. Another interesting thing is that reservist officers were more inclined to listen to advice because of their age. They tended to be about 10 years older than their active duty counterparts. Finally, while there were issues, commanders mostly understood and abided by the rules of engagement. And also, with some exceptions, they enforced rules on theft and vandalism. The final part I want to talk about is medical. Israel is kind of unique because it has this 2-tiered system of medical personnel. They have general medical providers who are medics and responder-trained combatants, what the U.S. Army might call medics and combat lifesavers. They also have senior medical providers who are paramedics or even doctors that are pushed down to company level. This isn't necessarily doctrine, but it was a practice used by Israeli special forces that was implemented in this situation. Typically, a paramedic or doctor was temporarily assigned to each company with 2 standard medics. This means that if an Israeli soldier was wounded, there was a very good chance they were going to be seen by an honest-to-God physician very quickly. On average, soldiers waited about 3 minutes before initial treatment and evacuation. They were usually in an operating room within 45 to 52 minutes. One soldier who was wounded told me, "The immediate medical care I received was flawless, and I was on a stretcher in a Humvee with a doctor within 10 minutes, and within 30 I was on a helicopter with medical equipment and doctors. Within 60 minutes of the explosion, I was under an X-ray in the hospital trauma room." This represents an exceptionally high standard of tactical medical care and medical evacuation responsiveness by any measure. Now, you might say that the relatively small battle space was a factor, and it certainly was, but there were other components. First is that the company doctor or paramedic was around. Then they were also constantly planning multiple evacuation routes or medevac landing zones while the company was engaged. The second is the use of whole blood, which is typically kept cold in a Humvee. Again, this might be due to the short logistical lines because blood does go bad after about 24 hours, but it was certainly an advantage. And the final item was the widespread use of the CAT, or Combat Application Tourniquet. Remember how I said that everything Israel does is because it's cheap? The one thing they don't do is skimp on survivability. And that's mainly because their army is so small that if they can prevent a minor injury from becoming a major injury, they know they can get that soldier back into the fight. Israel used to use rubber tourniquets for staunching bleeding, but recently they adopted the CAT tourniquet, or Combat Application Tourniquet. Well, there were some problems with counterfeit tourniquets, which I'll talk about later in this section of what went wrong. For the most part, these cat tourniquets saved lives. So that's what went right. Next, I'll talk about what went wrong. I'll be covering that next week, so click the link below to set a reminder or go to ryanmcbeth.substack.com to see the full thing. If you want to support the channel, grab my Intel Life t-shirt at Bunker Branding. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in part 2.
In the modern age of progress and preparedness, one thing separates the professional from the amateur: appearance. That's why forward-thinking Americans choose Bunker Branding Apparel, the official uniform of those who get things done. Each shirt is precision-engineered and field-tested under rigorous conditions such as extended YouTube filming operations, Substack editorial duty, and the occasional internet argument, designed for comfort, durability, and undeniable sense of tactical cool. So remember, citizens, when you're defending democracy, refueling freedom, or simply mowing the strategic lawn, Bunker Branding keeps you mission-ready, wrinkle-free, and unmistakably American.